I have the great pleasure of being here today with Caleb Crutchfield. Caleb, so nice to be with you here on the Midway podcast.
Thanks for having me, Matthew. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I was hoping that you could get us started by telling us a little bit about you. I'd love to learn about you more as a person. We were introduced through a mutual friend, Michael. But can you tell us a little bit about like where you grew up, how you grew up, and how this shaped who you are today, which we'll get into more a little bit as we go along the conversation.
I would love to. Thanks for asking. So I'm a Oklahoma boy, and most of Oklahoma is very rural, and I grew up just outside of Oklahoma City. Good blue collar family, hardworking family, and I was the youngest of three, so I've got two older sisters, and just kind of the fun-loving kid, and also that when you grow up with siblings older than you don't know what life is like to be alone. So you kind of crave relationships. I'm seeing that with my three boys as well. My youngest, he doesn't know life without his great older brothers, and I'm seeing that played and shaped my personality a lot. Um, I went into Christian ministry through college and a grad school program, a theology program after undergraduate um, studies. And because I wanted to help people, I liked people, I wanted to be around people, I wanted to think about what was good for people. And Jesus's concepts of love and loving your neighbor was um, life changing for me. And was down a track to become a pastor and had served as a pastor for several years, but really had a heart for people who weren't having some of these meaningful conversations. It really is it's wild to think Christians meet weekly to talk about the biggest ideas you can conceive, right? The meaning of life and how to be a people that are merciful and just. And so I loved being around friends who had different ideas, different beliefs, and had big questions. And I wanted them to consider the questions that I'm thinking of, and they're helping me think about the big questions of life too. And so, through a variety of circumstances, I got to be a part of an organization that invited people from a variety of different uh, perspectives to talk about those things, big questions of life. And I helped to take that strategy into the workplace because I was trying to connect with young professionals, and co-working locations were still trending at the time. We got to beta test the idea that we're doing now in 2018. And we were able to actually launch an organization centered around that focus of reaching young adults in the workplace with meaningful discussions, meaningful conversations. Um, and so we got to do that and survived COVID, literally and figuratively. And no one was really in the co-working space anymore, but fortunately co-working, even though it was the first to get hit by COVID shutdowns, meaning people are voluntarily showing up to work, they were the first location to show back up in office workplace environments. Um, so we do these once a month luncheons that we call Conversation Matters, that plays off the idea certain matters deserve a conversation. Some things are important enough we should talk about them, and yet having the conversation matters. Can I talk about the things that I care about with someone that has very different beliefs and values and perspectives on life, without being a jerk? And most people in the co-working space find that refreshing when they participate. They're like, oh, wow, that was better than I thought. And I loved hearing what so-and-so had to say. And that really, I resonated with that, where I really found like I didn't realize I disagreed with that perspective as much, but I appreciated how that person shared their perspective. Um, and so we stir up meaningful connections through a discussion forum on hopefully meaningful topics, which really connect to our decision making, and around the whole idea of what is good in most areas of life. So the organization is called Collaborate Good, right? So we want to collaborate together on good things. We want the outcome of our collaboration to be good. And when you think about asking the question, well, what is good when it comes to work? What is good work? And what is a good workplace? And what are good work relationships? What are good relationships in general? What's a good society? And those questions allow you to deepen connections quicker. And one of the jokes is this is a once a month luncheon that allows you to get to know the coworkers you want to know better and the ones you want to avoid all in 1 hour, right? So when people are talking about real things, you can find out, oh, that one, I'd like to talk to that guy more. And that person I would like to avoid at all costs. So we have a good time with that. But for the most part, it's high level topics that can drill down to very specific things that connect to politics, connect to beliefs and religious convictions there as well. But if you can stay high first and do that in a respectful way, you can then spill out into the workplace, like extending coffee bar conversations, taking each other to lunch to dig into that more. And so I'm in it for the people part. I love connecting people, connecting people and values to everyday decisions. I love connecting people to one another and helping them connect what are those values and beliefs that are driving their everyday decisions. And we get to do that in the workplace. That creates a more satisfying work environment where they have significant workplace relationships. And that creates membership retention at the co-working spaces. And so that allows us to partner with them at a deeper level as well. And they help reduce the costs of our program expenses and things.
Very cool. Yeah, it really is taking the co-working to a whole new level. Can you tell us, you said that you start with the higher level conversation and then drill deeper with that. Can you tell us about some of the topics that you've been talking about through these collaborations?
Yes. So September's topic of this year was playing off the Olympic, Summer Olympics that we just had. And the idea of the gold medal syndrome is really, we ask the question, what should we do when success disappoints, right? So the gold medal syndrome idea is where gold medalists, they've actually achieved these lifelong goals of investment of time and training and energy and resources to get to this goal, and they actually achieve it. That many of them have gone through some sort of spiraling depression because they don't know what's next, and they were expecting that achievement to do something more than it can do. One such gold medalist was Michael Phelps. He's been pretty honest about his mental health challenges after being one of, I think he's the most successful Olympian. And so to think the most successful has this issue, all of us are going to face it at some degree or another. So that's been a fun one that we just talked about. That was a new topic this year. One of the topics we use when we first launch into a new location is, when is it okay to change our minds? And we get to talk about all the nuances to what it takes for us to change our perspective. That could be a small thing, that could be a big thing, right? We were just talking about college football before the interview started, right? So when is it okay to start rooting for another team, especially a rival? My wife grew up an OU fan, and I grew up an Oklahoma State fan. You cannot root for that other team, but somehow our relationship had influenced us to go, at least I'm not going to root against them all the time anymore.
You
Right.
really
So
practice what
there's
you preach. Your relationship is even an example of bridging the divide between you guys. So well done.
That's so right. I love to share those personal examples as much as possible to get people to think about real life things that do influence. So that's a fun one. Another topic, and we can drill into any of these you want. Another topic is, when is it okay to change someone else's mind? We haven't done that one yet. I'm actually still creating some sub questions for that, but there's a lot in play there as well. So there's a lot of overlap with those two ideas. But decision making and pursuing what is good. We all want to live a good life, and we're all trying to find out what are the right boundaries to live that right life. Now, there's some subjectivity to that, but I would say there's got to be a lot of objectivity and shared reality if we're going to have just societies, right? Meaning we're going to live together with a shared understanding of what is good for humans and therefore what is harmful for humans, right? There has to be some shared reality there. For instance, the question itself, what is good for humans, has to be connected to your belief on what humans are made for, their meaning and purpose in life. So I've heard this from a philosophy um, teacher before, that you don't know what a good chair is unless you know what that chair is for. It's made for sitting and holding up weight at this maximum amount. So you're not going to judge that chair on whether it can send an email, because that's not what it's made for. But you're going to judge the chair whether it's good or not, whether it holds up a person of a certain weight limit, right? Um, so to say what is good for a human means we have to ask the question, well, what do I think a human is made for? And that's where we have to have a lot of shared understanding, right? And that's where our culture can lead us in a bad direction. For instance, I would say one of the cultural slogans of our time period, of our era, is meaning in life can be created. Every individual can create their own meaning in life. Now, where that comes into trouble is where someone's meaning in life is very different than mine and even conflicts with my meaning in life. Example, someone could say, my meaning in life, I want to kill it at business. I want to make as much money as I can. I don't mind using people to get to my level of success. And another person says, my meaning in life is to help the disenfranchised and the poor, and to see how, if they're in the same similar proximity, there can be a lot of contrasting and conflicting moments with someone like that, and a community built around those contrasting ideas, right? So if you create your own meaning, it can uh, conflict relationships in significant ways. But so that also means even the relationships you want to maintain, if those meanings diverge, you're actually choosing that meaning rather than the relationship. And some sociologists will say, if you give up on those relationships, those are probably your greatest chance at lifelong happiness, is having meaningful, loving relationships. There's a Harvard study on that, on what makes people happiest and healthiest is long-term committed relationships. And so if we make our meaning in life that different than someone else's, there's a lot of change there. There's a lot of conflict and there's a lot of divergence there in that situation. So what is good for humans is connected to our beliefs about what humans are made for. Now, what I love about the Christian view there is that the Bible says humans were made in God's image. They're made in a unique way, and they're made uniquely in relationship with God, to love God first and then to love other people as much as themselves. I find that incredibly compelling. Human existence is to love. Human existence is to love the being beyond all beings, and to love other people and his creation the way he loves it. Who wouldn't want to live there, right? Who wouldn't want to live in a society where we're actually loving and doing what's good for others, even when it means I'm losing something? It's costing me to do this good thing, to do what is loving in that situation. So other people having the conversation, what is your belief about human purpose and meaning that is significant enough you think other people should agree with you? And in that conversation, you are trying to persuade them on what is just then and how we should treat other people. What is just and
Hmm.
unjust.
Hmm. So do you feel like, Caleb, like as we drill down to the fundamental way that people see the our purposes, that there is a lot of difference there? Or do you think that maybe people just aren't recognizing that maybe they do agree with kind of the worldview that really resonates with you and you find so beautiful, which is to serve God, or maybe people might describe it just to serve the universe or their higher purpose,
Mm-hmm,
to love
mm-hmm.
people, to experience love. Like, do you feel like we're actually all aligned on that level, or there are a lot of differences in the way that we're interpreting our purpose in the world, and that's maybe causing conflict?
That's a great question. And that actually came out of a lot of my conversations with Michael, our mutual friend. He's like, aren't we just talking different language here? And so even to slightly correct um, your reflection of what I was saying is it's not just serving God, it's actually loving God is what the Bible is telling us that humans should be doing. To love, which means he's a person, he's a being to love, and we love him because he first loved us. He shows us love. Imagine this. Most of us understand love because we experience it from another person, right? Our parents. And that's where a lot of trauma comes out when we don't experience love or we experience incredible pain from people that should have been the most protective and loving. Think about those traumatic incidents. It's a violence against the way we were made. And we feel that in our psyche and in our actual body when we are dealing with that kind of trauma. So, but the idea of loving, yes, there's a lot of overlapping ideas from other religious perspectives and other just worldview perspectives in general. But you do have to define that word loving. But I will tell you this, as much as there are shared ideas on that, which is great. And I think a lot of that's tied to a history of our culture and our country on this concept of loving our neighbor that was so infused in so much of the founding of our country that that language is shared in most Western societies. There's a lot of fun historical research on how those shared values that we care about the most actually have come from the Christian worldview. These ideas of loving your neighbor, this idea of justice, these idea of human rights, where Yuval Harari, who wrote the book Sapiens, he's Jewish, but he's atheist. He's coming from a secular perspective. He says human rights are a belief system. And if you don't believe in the Christian worldview or the Judeo-Christian worldview, then really it just becomes a power play. He basically says that humans don't have any greater rights than an ape. Now, I think that's a dangerous situation if we go there. But you see how that's connected to a belief system of what are humans, where do humans come from? What are they made for? What is their purpose? So origins and meaning and destiny are part of the questions of a worldview there.
This episode is brought to you by Athletic Greens. Athletic Greens, are you? No. Okay. Um, this episode is actually not sponsored. Caleb and I recorded this podcast on two different dates. We actually recorded the first one and then circled back and decided that we needed to chat about more. There was just so much that we didn't get to. So there was like 3 or 4 months in between. So there's a bit of an awkward transition here. So that's why this is happening right now. So
let's scoot back to where you the framework that you had on a belief system that you start with and engage the world compared to a position of I'm going to engage the world and then determine my belief system, my value system through that experience. Could you give me some boundaries to that aspect specifically? What do you think a starting point would be for someone that you care about, that's a young adult that says, hey, I came from this belief system, or really my family didn't have a set belief system, but I want to live a good life and I want to be accepted by certain people. What are the steps you're going to give them in the boundaries you're going to give them as you lead them in that direction? Maybe
okay,
boundaries.
that's a good question. So I think that gets to the question, where are people deriving their belief systems and their values from? Are they deriving it from societal norms, or is there a religious or spiritual or philosophical framework that they're using? And those things are often intertwined and mixed together in our society, of course. So I think that there is an existing set of beliefs there. And of course, there's that we generally share. I mean, we're probably not too far off in the beliefs and values that we have. And then those are, of course, different across cultures and families and individuals. But to your question of where does someone start, they probably inherit something from their family and their culture around them. And I guess that would be a starting place. You have to start somewhere. I guess the idea that I wanted to bounce off of you and see if we're on the same page and just get your thoughts on this is like, I agree with you that it's important to start somewhere and you need ideology and a belief system to guide your behavior. But what I have come to, I guess, believe, which is now it's kind of funny word to use, but what I've come to believe through my experience
Yeah.
is that we can continue to update those belief systems based on what works for us.
Yeah.
So whether it's pragmatic or not, and what works is whether it's bringing me a sense of either fulfillment or meaning or happiness. It's I think people know whether that's working for their life. So my sort of worldview that I wanted to bounce off of you is that we need ideology to guide our behavior. And we also need to be open enough to be able to update the ideology based on what works versus having that to remain rigid. And I don't know where that leaves us with ideologies that have been really time tested over time. So we're talking about now religion,
Yes.
Christianity, Judaism, whatever it might be. Those have really been time tested. So we know we can trust them. But then there's a point where it feels like they might need to be updated and flexible enough to be able to work for us. And maybe religions evolve just like human beings evolve and need to be updated. So I wanted to get your perspective on that. Like, is it a constant process of going from belief to updating that belief, and now you have new beliefs and so on and so on?
I think there's a lot of overlap in what I'm thinking about the existing religious worldviews and the newer worldviews that kind of give birth out of those, right? None of us can start, like you said, from like a blank slate. We've all come from our backgrounds that we didn't choose. You know, most of it we didn't fully choose. We had kind of coerced on us. Some of those were good experiences, some of those were bad experiences, right? Whether that was religious or non-religious. And so I do think there is an updating of those worldviews, whether that's religious or non-religious, based on our experience, because that's how we're testing whether there's truth to them, right? And
Right.
by truth, I mean it matches reality. This idea that I was told when I was younger, did it actually play out about who I am as a human and the internal struggles that I actually am going to have and that I do have, and the way that I want to treat people, and then the way I actually treat people? I see that tension. I see that conflict. And so, how do I navigate that? What do I view about myself now that I didn't treat that person the way I wanted to treat them or the way I thought a good person should treat them? That's all worldview ideology based, right? The person I want to be, whether that was informed by a religious perspective or just the people I respect, my parents, grandparents, a great friend that I felt like always did things right. um, those views have imprinted themselves on us and informed us on the good people. And honestly, that's where we start to view those that aren't good people. So we have this view of who's good, and then we have the view of who's not good. What worldview is updated enough to include the most diverse group of people, but also that's real enough, that matches reality enough that it's okay to confront people in a posture of care and benevolence so that the people we love don't go through some harmful experience. Now, that's where it can get very subjective, right? Am I just imposing my past experience on this friend that might navigate the situation differently? That's where you're like, hey, there needs to be some humility in engaging that situation. Say, hey, when I've experienced this before, this is what I found out about myself, and this is what I found out about the others that were involved in that situation. I think that's a humble position, right? Doesn't that show an openness to what's going on? But there's also some things I think most humans should agree on in how to treat humans if there really is something to this idea of justice and human rights. There is a baseline that all humans should agree humans are valuable because of this, and you've got to find out why humans are valuable. That's not determined by sexuality, gender, age, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, or their capacity to contribute to society. What makes humans valuable if it transcends all of those categories, right? What worldview is going to include all those people to say, you're in. And you're not outside, you're inside. You are part of the human community. And so I must treat you in this way. A worldview has to answer that question. And there are newer and newer issues that continue to fragment us and create new enemies, for lack of a better term. We create newer and newer people that oppose who we are. So yes, that was a long-winded answer. I think the worldview must update based on the new challenges. I'll give you one really tangible example. As a Christian, the view of the idea of technology and the digital technology that we're dealing with now has a lot of ethical implications. So it has to be updated in that sense. How to love neighbors and friends and family members who continue to go into new sexual, and I would say sexual ideologies, sexual lifestyles. How do I love them well with those challenges have to be updated. But you see, the baseline for me and the Christian view is, how do I love the people around me with truth, right? And sometimes I need to be honest where that's more subjective than it is baseline truth. I think that's where Christians get off as very judgmental. They want people to live and act just the way they do, very culturally defined or even family defined. But what I'm saying is, if there is something like human rights and justice, there has to be something true about humans across the board, from all generations, from all time periods and cultures. And then there is a way in which we engage with those realities that should be loving and beneficial. And I don't know how else to navigate relationships without being very honest about that position. Does that make sense? Being very honest with, first of all, I care about the people around me, and especially the ones I'm responsible for or closest to me. I care about them. I love them. I want what's good for them. And my view of what is good, is it just subjective? Or is there something very real about it that means when I tell a friend, hey, I don't think you should treat yourself that way, and I don't think you should treat these other people that way, that it's something beyond just what Caleb has to say, but is true about all humans. Does that make sense? That's where the sexuality conversation does come into play, and we can go down that path. But I'm saying beyond sexuality, humans should treat other humans this way. We should relate to people in a certain way. And like you said, there's a shared understanding, especially within our context. The Western world has been influenced for millennia on these Christian ideas. Now, you look at societies that haven't been influenced by those Christian ideals, and you will see very different views on people that are different, and the way you should treat women. And for instance, the Hindu caste system in India. Now, there's some interesting history to that I've learned in the last few years, but those are real views about humanity that directly determine decision-making, how to treat your neighbor idea.
Caleb, I'm wondering, you piqued my interest. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about like some of the Christian views of technology. That might be a good concrete example for us to start to ask some of these questions around like what is good. So tell me a little bit more about that. What do you mean by that?
So that's so good. So the technology conversation really does, it connects to the sexuality conversation. It connects to the neighbor conversation, because in the question of what is good, you have to ask, how does this impact me? But also that how does this impact others? If your baseline belief for your worldview, your ideology is, I want to love my neighbor as myself, which means my decisions are no longer just about me. They obviously include me, but they're not just about me. So they include other people. So technology as a tool that can do things, and those things are determined as good or bad based on what it does to me and what it does to other people,
Can you give
right?
us an example of like something? Yeah, that would, yeah.
So an example of what it does to me. So for instance, the social media piece is a big one, right? So um, Jonathan Haidt, who is not a, was it Haidt? Is it Jonathan Haidt or Haidt?
I think it's Hyde, but I mean, it's, yeah, either way.
I'll keep going. So he's recently come out with that book, The Anxious Generation. He is he's Jewish by ethnicity, but I believe he's agnostic or atheistic. And so he's not coming from this from a religious perspective, but he just is talking about how technology impacts the individual that's using it, specifically social media, right? So that's one good example. When I use some form of technology that was meant, at least the way I understand it, social media was meant to connect people. It's ended up becoming a very individualistic and isolationist activity that gets people down a path that isolates their thinking with people that only think like them, that gets them to compare themselves with other people and continue to present people as such opposing ideas that like enemy becomes a real thing, and justification to oppose those ideas and those people really become a dangerous place, right? So there's a way in which we engage in technology that does something to me. The other idea, and I think the Jonathan Haidt book gives us that clear example from at least the data that he was and the research he was doing on how much that impacts the way we think, specifically on children. Now, how does it treat others, right? Well, obviously, the way it impacts me forms the way that I then engage with others. My wife and I were just talking about family members, aging family members who are spending too much time on social media. I'm talking older family members. And the way they now engage with us is very different. And I would say not to the positive because of the time they're spending with certain ideologies online, where they're not actually engaging with differing views with people in person. So the way we use technology is obviously impacting us, which impacts the way we treat others.
There's an underlying assumption there, which is that what you started out with, which is that what is good would be good for the individual and for relationships and for the collective as well. And I'm wondering if like that is I think most people would agree with that, but people might say, okay, well, we don't necessarily need a religious framework to come to that conclusion. We don't need religion to, to guide us. And so I'm curious what you would say in response to that. And yeah, I'll just let you take that.
Well, so for instance, there's going to be a lot of shared views of how to treat people again within our Western context, that there's probably a lot of shared idea of what's harmful, what's not harmful. More and more of our culture is saying, or at least agreeing to the idea that pornography as an industry is not good for people, but also those that consume it is not good. I think we would probably agree with that. And yet it's the most lucrative industry in our culture. I mean, it more than all the professional sports. Like, so we would say that that's true, but what are we willing to do to actually combat those ideas and even combat an industry in that way? So I've kind of explained the Christian baseline view of loving your neighbor as yourself. I think the cultural idea, and not everyone agrees with this, but people that I've studied have helped identify if it's a non-religious worldview, the idea of expressive individualism is somewhere in the foundation, which means personal happiness found in individual expressing of those deepest and most repetitive or strongest desires is really the meaning of life, which allows us to then create our own meaning. It gives us more subjective morality frameworks, and it allows us to pursue the things that we've uh, determined to be life-giving, meaningful, and good, right? So an expressive individualism idea connects to the sexuality idea that says the whole meaning in life and human existence is for us to know who we are and our deepest desires so that we can live those out. And anything that prevents me from living out those deepest desires, I need to avoid or I need to even oppose because those deepest desires are what's truest about me, and will lead me to the life that I want, which includes happiness and fulfillment. Have you do you want to comment on that idea? Have you heard of that expression, expressive individualism?
I have not heard that expression, but just so that I know that I'm understanding correctly, you're saying that that's the idea that my personal desires are kind of what's most important, and the fulfillment of those personal desires is where I'm deriving meaning, and that's the purpose of my life. And I'm guessing that that would be starkly in contrast to the belief system that you have and that you're advocating would be good. Is that right?
Right. Yes.
Okay.
So that might get to some of the more of the direct conflicts which can play out in all these human categories, all these topics is if my view of what is good in life is really following what I find to be true in myself. And that seems to be at the baseline of what we started off with in engaging the world to form my ideas rather than evaluating what are my views of what is good and letting those guide me. Um, the expressive individualism idea says the determiner, the determination of truth is internal. And so it makes it difficult to correct any negative thinking. So, for instance, and I think I mentioned this earlier, one of our conversation matters topics is how do we know when we shouldn't trust our feelings? So, in one sense, our society says, follow your feelings, follow your truth, do what makes you happy. And then we have this month in May that says, hey, we should be aware of mental health, right? It's mental health awareness. And so, one of the questions I like to ask is if it's true that my inner feelings is the most true idea of myself and what is good in the world, how do I confront negative feelings, especially if those negative feelings are persistent and strong?
Caitlin, can I suggest that let's use an example here, and I think might be helpful just to if you want to come up with one, but for me, the one that comes up is like if someone if someone thinks that they're gay or is having,
Yep.
or is not sure, they're conflicted about their sexual orientation or identity or something like that. Yeah. So if you're open to kind of using that as an
Absolutely.
example, okay,
Can I go even further? Like
sure,
the transgender conversation in
sure.
children genuinely going through gender dysphoria. And the studies that I've found, these are tracking with the United Kingdom, the CASS study, I believe, CASS was the researcher, and they did research on these children who are genuinely dealing with gender dysphoria. And as a Christian, I believe that's a real thing. People can wrestle with the idea, am I the right gender that my biology is presenting? I, the Christian view allows for that kind of confusion. But how do we love someone when they're going through that confusion is a very important thing we've got to consider. So the CAS study basically helped to shut down the WPATH uh, clinics in the UK, meaning they said, we haven't found enough positive evidence for us to promote hormone treatment and surgical treatment for children going through gender dysphoria. So, for instance, the point is someone could have really strong desires, questions, anxiety about, am I actually the gender that my biology presents? Well, what they have found is if you just go with their internal feelings and you end up treating the child because you think their inner feelings are telling the truth with hormones, or even more severely with surgery, they found that doesn't help that child's depression, anxiety, or confusion. But what you've done has made permanent changes for that child, um, that didn't have any study to say let's move forward with these very extreme um, measures when it's irreversible, right? Even hormone treatments aren't necessarily reversible, but surgical obviously is devastating, and most of the treatments are not reversible.
Yeah.
Um,
Generally speaking, right? So I mean,
exactly.
that data is showing, generally speaking, the treatments are generally irreversible, but a lot of times kids might transition, they're
Right.
following their feelings. They might end up in a place where they change their mind or they regret it. Some kids don't regret it. Some kids continue
Yeah,
to identify they're seemingly happy with that gender. So, but to use this as a lens for kind of understanding like the um the position of like following your own feelings versus using something external to guide you.
that's right.
So I think it fits very well, like the argument to use an external system for the
Yeah.
kids that end up regretting their decision, I think, because then we can say, well, that's why we have these belief system. That's why we have religion that says that is, grounded in all these years of history that says that this is probably not the best way to live. And so there's proof right there. But then what about the kids that end up saying, yeah, I'm really happy with that decision or it works for me. And I really feel like, what would you
Yeah.
say for that? Should they continue to follow their feelings or do they need to rely on a belief system as well?
That really gets to the point of what you're trying to ask. I would say for children, we need to allow them to move through puberty fully before um, any of those type of severe changes happens, because the bottom line is an adult has to help and consent to the treatment of that child. They're basically the guardian, the custodian of that child during the season of life before they can make legal and adult choices for themselves. So just think about that with parenting in general. We are constantly, any parent is constantly saying, this is the boundary of what is good for my child or not. Now, obviously, that can be abusive in certain circumstances. So I'm not saying that that's always good, but who is most responsible for that child's well-being? It is the parent. And the idea of saying, hey, what works for them? Um, so let me give you another example, kind of again, staying in this world of sexuality. If if we move beyond the childhood situation and we say two consenting adults can be sexual with each other, and that's good because both of them consented, both of them were at the appropriate age to do that. Well, what are the other factors that need to be involved for us to make a decision whether it's good or not? Wouldn't we need to know if this other person is in an already committed, loving relationship with someone else? And more specifically, wouldn't we want to know if um, that relationship included children, right? So how does that paint the picture of what is good between these two people? It's not good for the child if their mom or dad has sex with another consenting adult. Now, the two adults might say, "Hey, that works for me," but does that work for the child? Um, And does that work for the other spouse who's experienced the infidelity of a spouse in that way, right? So why is that messy? Why does that feel wrong? Because there's already a committed, loving relationship involved there, and there's obligation now to that relationship. That means I'm going to resist this very strong feeling to pursue this romantic relationship over here because I have a loving commitment over here and a loving commitment to this child and the well-being of the child. Now, here's what's interesting. We usually disregard the children pretty quickly, especially in our society. But what's best for children is having biological mom and dad in a loving marriage in the household, at least through adulthood. I mean, the studies show that children that don't have that structure are um, hindered in some significant ways
Yeah.
because of that. Now, that deserves a whole conversation. So that's just not what sociology says. But again, is sociology just agreeing with what is a traditional view of marriage and family? They're trying to really ask hard questions as far as what I've found. And honestly, I think most in behavioral science would want to prove Christianity wrong and those seemingly conformist views of marriage and family. But the realities are what they are about romance, marriage, children. They all go together in that regard. So what works can become very individualistic if you leave the question there. Does it work for me? But if you say, does this work not only for me, but those that I have loving obligations to? Now, again, that's based on the worldview. I want to know the God of love and I want to love others as much as myself. Now, who doesn't want a family like that? Who doesn't want to live in a neighborhood like that? Now, if my view is I'm going to follow my inner feelings, my most persistent or my strongest feelings, then most guys are going to be idiots in that situation. If a woman shows an openness to a sexual relationship and the man says, my whole purpose in life is to do what is most fulfilling, meaningful to me, what makes me happiest, what works for me, they would probably take this sexual engagement, the sexual
Hmm.
opportunity there. Now, that is such a stereotype, but I'll stop there. Yeah.
No, that's okay. I mean, but I want to kind of follow that example because I think these are good because it's helping us to kind of stress test the ideas and the
Yes.
concepts that we're talking about. But I want to take that example, like a guy who is single, let's say, um, who wants to have consensual sex before marriage. Now, let's say,
Yes.
because in the example that you gave, one of the partners maybe like had a kid or a family or something like that. But let's take the example. Let's say these are two people. They're, 25, 30 years old or whatever. They're both single. They're not in relationships. They don't have any kids. They're just two people. They, just living their lives in the world and they meet and they want to have sex with each other consensually. It's good for them. So make the case for me that there would still be that it's not good or that somehow it's impacting others in a negative way. If we're putting them, I know this is an extreme example, but like just imagining that like no one else around them is harmed. There's going to be no jealousy from their friends, their family members don't care. They have the same belief system. They're just like, yeah, we're going to have sex tonight. It's going to be great. And then we're going to go about the rest of our life.
There you go. So that's a great example. And I think um, to ask the question, what other relationships could be impacted by this consensual decision is part of the decision-making process, right? So um, from the Christian view, it says, hey, if I just have sex with this person outside of marriage, it could just be a one-time thing. Well, that's a very selfish view of that act. Sexuality from the Christian view is supposed to be a self-giving, self and others focused act, which actually makes sex much more pleasurable, much more if you're actually thinking about the pleasure of the other person. Uh, and yet, I have thought about this example. What else comes to mind if it's just two single people is did this person used to date one of my friends? And how long ago was that relationship, right? Or does this person come from a family that I really respect or from a family I don't even care about and I would love to exploit them, right? Do I engage here? Well, think about this. There might have been relationships in high school where I saw friends who wouldn't have dated this person, but because they were physically attractive, but not as a whole person, just physically attractive. They're like, I would, right? What's the term? I would hit that, but you might not want to be in a relationship there. That is not good from the Christian perspective because you're just using that person. You're just
Okay, so it'd be
using it.
harming, but what if the other person was equally like, okay, I want to hit that as well, and
Exactly.
we have
Yes.
no friends in common, we're not hurting anybody else,
That's right.
like, yeah.
It's just a physical thing. We're going to get over this. The reality is, when I'm thinking of the examples that I have in my head, that person would have said they would love to have that situation. The one who's not long-term material, if you will, but just, someone is in the power position there. And the one that's not in the power position will like, I will do whatever just to be close to you, just to be near you, just to have that moment with you. And yet, would that actually help that person long term? Now, again, the Christian view of power should be you should use your power for the good of those around you. You should use your power for the good of that individual, but also anyone else. And so that's part of the lens in which Christians should be looking at that. Now, again, Christians, we blow through those boundaries way too often. But that's one way to see, even in that scenario, there are more people involved than just those two people. Past relationships, what do I know about the family? But more specifically, what is good for that person? Because if you're really judging the view on what is the ultimate goal of sexuality, that gets to the good question, right? What is the ultimate goal of sexuality? Is it just personal pleasure, or is there something about sexuality that does something in a relationship that deepens, that connects, and then in a certain relationship, it's the best place to engage in sexuality because that is the way that humans reproduce, right? That is the way that the next generations are going to be grown up and how they're going to be raised and so on. That it's those decisions should never be viewed simply from that individual pleasure idea. That's at least the Christian worldview. Now, we could play out if both people just keep going down that path of saying, man, we just had this moment, but then how many moments like that can you have with how many partners? And how many partners can become too many partners? That's a view of good sexuality. And because I start to ingrain myself with having multiple partners is a good thing, will I ever be able to faithfully commit to anyone? And is that even part of my worldview of what good sexuality is? Um, and I would say again, contrasting the more traditional view, the Christian view, but also traditional with all these other worldviews of marriage fidelity. They saw something good in that marriage fidelity idea because of children and so on. Now, again, there's nuances there, but the idea um, of faithfulness in marriage is a good thing because that's the best place to have family. And if people have kind of seared their conscience, if you will, have numbed themselves from the idea of faithfulness, it makes that ultimate view of faithful marriage very difficult. Um, but if that's not the view, how does that work? So again, help me play out the idea if two people just have whatever sexual partners they want to have until when? And what is the boundary? I think anyone listening to this podcast would say, if I met someone that I actually wanted to have a long-term relationship with, and I found out they had this many sexual partners in the past, how would that make us feel? What would that make us feel about, well, I thought I wanted to have a long-term relationship with you, but you have this past that makes me skeptical whether you can commit to me long-term, right? So what other questions come to mind when we think about that? What's the ultimate goal of sexuality? It always goes beyond just personal pleasure because people really do. I think women are more honest with this than men, but it's true for men. Men want sexual faithfulness. If now it's easy for us if we're in our 20s and 30s because we think, I'm not ready to settle down. But what do we think about when we're in our late 30s or early 40s? What does good sexuality look like then? And have I set myself up to have that good experience that's in my mind of sexuality in my 40s if I've lived this other way in my 20s and 30s?
Mhm.
Now, what
Yeah.
questions come up for you there?
No, okay, kind of an unrelated question, and maybe it's not unrelated, but the question that came up for me in that is like, because I think I'm on board with you. If you play it out long enough, you're going to see how that a particular behavior is going to negatively impact yourself. Speak from my experience, negatively impact yourself and or the people around you. And so from your argument, you would say, okay, well, you play these things out long enough, you'll see what's good because you'll see that it's not going to work for you. It's not going to work for the people around you. My question for you, Caleb, is from a Christianity, from a religious perspective, do you think that these ideals and these values and these, I don't know, I'll call them rules, but these guidelines were created through trial and error over time? Or do you think that they came from like God, that they were handed down from God? Because I think that, well, let you answer first and then I'll respond. Yeah.
So my position is coming from that position of faith that God ordained, that God made humans with specific purposes. First of all, to love God, then to love other people, love his creation in general. And all of that is relationally connected, which means the love idea is everywhere, but to appropriately love, right? I don't love my children the same way I love my wife. I don't love my friends the same way I love my family, right? But there's love in the midst of all that, in all those situations. So I do come from that position that it was created first. Now, again, to go back to your point a while ago, has it changed throughout time? Yes, I do think so. And I think there's been experiences that have helped form that and change that. But it is, and honestly, it's some of the experiences that have created new issues that have changed some of those relationships. Some things come to mind there, but keep going. Was there more to that?
Yeah, because I feel like and I know we might have to end on this because we're getting towards the end here, but I feel like if we're coming from the position of like, okay, we're just trying to figure out like really what works, I feel like you know you can get everyone on board with that. Like we can all align around that if we're all of the mindset of like, let's just figure out what works. And if people are coming from that philosophical framework, then eventually I think you'd be able to get people on board with the notion that it's probably best to wait till marriage to have sex because people would be open to observing their behavior. They'd be open to that argument. But I think that from a people make the argument that, okay, this is what God wants, it loses a lot of people. And then they're like, okay, I'm going to stick with what I think is right because I don't believe in a higher power and that's silly and everything. So, which is also to say that kind of my belief is like that maybe what, okay, let me just pause there actually. It's getting complicated, but I feel like there's something coming up for you.
So many good things in that situation. And it really does point, the heart of Christianity says humans have rebelled against God. Like we don't want anyone to tell us what to do. And yet we actually long for people to tell us what to do. So we love to not, for instance, there's certain influencers in your life, whether they're tangible friends, people, mentors, or just people online that we respect in the way they think, the way they articulate ideas. If we sometimes we follow what they have to say without even fully thinking through it because we like and appreciate them so much already, right? So in one sense, we want to work it out for ourselves. But if those people said, "Hey, I've gone down that path, you shouldn't try that because you haven't thought big picture." What are we going to do? We're probably going to listen to them and at least pause in our reflection. Now, they may or may not be an expert in the thing that we're considering, but we'll probably listen to them regardless. If they are expert in something that we're very limited in our knowledge, we're probably going to take them for what they have to say, and we will probably change our view just because of the relationship. Isn't that interesting? And obviously, that relationship is built and trust is built and all those other things. Um, and so, experience is a good teacher. But if most of us think about those times of regret and we would have thought, I wish I would have listened to so and so. I wish I would have asked for input from so and so. I wish I would have even followed my gut intuition, maybe even some of these convictions that came from your religious perspective. To I wish I would have not done my own thing, but would have listened to some of those things. The way you even phrase the worldview idea, that there's these things that are time tested, it's worth at least evaluating whether those things are true to human existence. And I think there's a lot more to be said about all those things there. Because I'm with you. My wife, I'll give you this example. The person I hate, I hate it when my wife, I don't hate my wife. I hate it when my wife points out something that I know is true about me. That is something I don't like, something I did wrong, some continual habit. Now, she doesn't even do it. She doesn't even point it out in a mean way, but that just points out a thing about human existence that I think is true from the Christian perspective, that I don't like to be told that I'm wrong. I don't like to acknowledge I don't like to be told that I'm wrong. I don't like to be confronted with that. And she loves me the most. She obviously is the most invested in me making good decisions, right? Um, and yet I still have a hard time hearing that from her. So imagine if there is a God of the universe that loves me way more than my spouse does, is way more invested in me and cares way more and knows way more about me. And he has said certain things that I should do and certain things I should not do because it helps me become a more loving person. I want to listen to that. And actually, it's led me to trust him more and more with even some of the bigger questions I have. Because I think that foundational view of love, undeserved love that God has shown me in Jesus, frames up life in a really beautiful way. And it leads me to be self-controlled. It leads me to self-limit, which is love. I have to say no to myself in some ways because I want what's best for my child. I want what's best for my wife. I can't spend my time or my money the same way as I did as a single person because I'm lovingly obligated to the good of my children. I'm lovingly obligated to the good of my wife, which means I better spend time with them. I better use my resources for their good. Now, if it just felt obligated, I would be a begrudging husband and a begrudging dad. But if I love them, that self-sacrifice is actually deeply fulfilling, which connects to a lot of these other studies, the Harvard study on happiness and health being connected to lifelong committed relationships. So even, forgive me, even from that Harvard study, I think it's Schultz is the last name of the director. I think decision making based on how this can impacts my long-term committed relationships. That's a good starting point. Now, the Christian view is exactly that. How can I love other people, even those that are different than me? And that means leaning into the truth with them, even when that might be a hard conversation. But if I've proven myself to be a loving person, they're going to hopefully hear it, even if we disagree. And I think that's really what makes relationships the most worthwhile is if we can be very honest. We all want to change each other's minds to what's best, what's good. And if we just follow the expressive individualism, it's just me, it's just going to what works for me. You miss out on the big picture and the long-term picture, and you miss out on what could be the most deeply fulfilling aspects of life because it leads you individually to a place that minimizes the needs and the well-being of those around us. It's so interesting how other people impact us and how we impact other people. And I think that's the way that we're made as humans.
Caleb, thank you so much for sharing you and all of these ideas and everything. And again, for what you do, I'm going to let you go because I know that you're a husband and a dad who's very much in demand right now. But I just want to thank you again so sincerely for having these conversations. And I know that there's more to come, whether it's with us or in the groups that you're running. So I look forward to continuing to follow along with your work.
Thank you for having me. Such a thoughtful discussion. I think people want to engage with these ideas. So good work. Continue on. If we can be a part of I would love to just be part of the conversation in the future. I love what you're doing. Thank you.
100%. Likewise. Yeah. Thank you.